Okay, in this video we're just going to look at a couple of examples of how changes in relative prices can impact resource allocation. So the first one is explain the role of relative prices of the carbon tax on solar electricity. So explain using the idea of relative prices what happens in the solar electricity market when we put a carbon tax on coal-powered technology. And the idea is that solar panels do not use carbon, so solar energy becomes cheaper when we put a carbon tax on coal energy. So here's an example. So we've got coal-fired electricity and solar electricity. What will happen is that if there's a higher relative price caused by an increase in production costs, resources will shift out of the production of that good or service and into the other one. So we should see resources flow out of this industry and into this industry. And I'm going to explain why that occurs. So when we put a carbon tax on coal-fired electricity, you would need to state that that tax is placed on producers, which shifts the supply curve to the left, and that leads to a higher relative price of coal-fired electricity. Then what happens is because the relative price of coal-fired electricity is more expensive, and because it's due to higher production costs, that makes that market less profitable. And what happens in the market for solar electricity is it now experiences a lower relative price relative to carbon because the price of carbon-based electricity has gone up. Because of the lower relative price of solar electricity, the demand for solar electricity then increases or shifts to the right because there's now more demand at any given price. This shift in the demand curve to the right leads to a shortage of solar electricity, so self-interested producers raise the price, and that increase in price lures producers to shift more resources into solar electricity. So essentially the carbon tax both increases and decreases the relative price of solar panels. Firstly, solar panels' relative price falls when comparison to coal-fired electricity because there's now a tax on coal-based electricity. The demand for solar panels therefore increases due to its lower relative price, and therefore the demand curve shifts to the right, which causes a higher price. Resources are then shifted out of the production of coal-fired electricity and into solar panels because the price of solar panels has increased and it's more profitable because of the increase in demand. Yes, it's still got a lower relative price compared to carbon, but that's not because of higher production costs. So resources are shifted out of the production of coal-fired electricity and into solar panels. There's an expansion in supply of solar panels due to the higher profit opportunities because of the higher relative price. The relative price of solar panels will then rise compared to other products, even though it's got a lower relative price in total compared to the carbon-based electricity. How would the removal of the carbon tax impact relative prices and resource allocation? Okay, you need to slowly step your way through the question. So relative prices, define what that means, refers to the price of one good or service compared to another. The removal of the carbon tax is likely to reduce the price of non-renewable or coal-based electricity because firms face lower costs of production. So you start with the impact on the market for coal. Therefore, there will be an increase in the relative price of renewable energy compared to coal. And as the relative price of non-renewable energy is now lower, consumers will now substitute back into non-renewable energy. So it lowers the relative price of non-renewable energy, the relative price of renewable energy goes up, and therefore consumers shift back into the cheaper alternative. This can be seen in the shift in the demand curve left for solar or wind energy because there's now less demand at any given price. This decrease in demand should lead to a lower price, and self-interested producers will shift resources out of the market because there's less relative profits available in that industry. That's the step. 1, lead to a lower relative price because of lower costs of production for coal. 2, the relative price of solar energy goes up, which leads to less demand. 3, because demand shifts to the left for solar energy, it leads to a lower price, and self-interested producers shift resources out of the market. How can an Alkyl tax impact relative prices and resource allocation? What's an Alkyl tax going to do to the relative price of Alkyl? It's going to increase the relative price. So the Alkyl tax, which is placed on producers, increases the relative price of mixed alcoholic beverages because of the increase of cost of production. This reduces the profitability of Alkyl. The higher relative price also deters consumption, or there's a contraction in demand. And as consumers reduce their consumption, self-interested producers shift their land, labour and capital out of this industry into more profitable areas. The higher relative price of Alkyl unfortunately reduces the relative price of other harmful substances like illicit drugs and beer. So even though resources shift out of Alkyl, which is good, it can have negative implications because we shift resources into things like illicit drugs and beer. This can unfortunately increase the demand for these substitute products, lead to higher prices, and more resources will be allocated to those areas. So initially they have a lower relative price, but the increase in demand then increases the price. Not quite as high as alcopops, but still above what they used to be. How would advances in technology impact the relative price of electric cars and the allocation of resources? Well, advances in technology would lower the relative price of electric cars because they're cheaper to produce. And because they're cheaper to produce, they'll become more profitable, which will lead to resources flowing into that industry. The lower prices will also cause an expansion in demand, so it will increase the demand for electric cars, and therefore, again, more and more resources will flow into the industry because of the lower relative price. Lastly, another example of relative prices is the mining boom. So when we had a mining boom caused by China demand in a lot of our commodities, that led to a higher relative price of commodities, and therefore more resources, land, labour and capital. So for example, land that was once used for schools and recreation was dug up for minerals, truck drivers and workers and teachers and things like that went and work in the mines, and capital resources were also allocated into investment in the mining industry because of the higher profits. Thank you.